Welcome to 2-Bit Gaming. Today's topic, the Game Boy Advance. Last time I talked about this, and this. If you haven't seen that video, I recommend watching it first, to give a better perspective on the Game Boy brand. The Game Boy killed off every handheld competitor, and Nintendo had become a monopoly in portable gaming. Nintendo didn't have to develop anything new, but that didn't stop them from releasing a successor. In 2001, 3 years after the release of the Game Boy Color, Nintendo released the Game Boy Advance. This is a custom paint job I did to resemble the Famicom, which is the Japanese version of the NES. Although developed alongside the Game Boy Color, it is not an 8-bit or 16-bit system. The Game Boy Advance actually has a 32-bit RISC processor and is capable of graphically even more than the Super Nintendo. It is still fully compatible with the entire Game Boy and Game Boy Color library of games, which means that there are tons of quality games to play. The screen is larger and now features a wide aspect ratio, higher resolution, and appears much sharper. In addition to the standard Game Boy buttons, the Game Boy Advance has left and right shoulder buttons thanks to its controller-like shape. It almost resembles the layout of a Sega Game Gear. It runs on 2 AA batteries and feels pretty light and sturdy, comfortable in your hands. The one drawback is that the screen is not backlit. In fact, to see the screen well, one must position a bright light just right and try not to let it glare. Many aftermarket products were produced to help light the screen. There was even a modification kit to light the screen from inside, but it washed out the colors. The best solution I've found is the floodlight. The downside is that it adds a lot of weight and bulk to the system, so it can cause some wrist strain. Nintendo addressed all the screen problems in 2003 when they released the Game Boy Advance SP. This is the silver one, and I've applied a retro skin to it. It was a significant upgrade over the previous model. It featured a compact flip-style design, a rechargeable internal battery, and a front-lit screen. It wasn't as comfortable to play, and seems a little small in an adult's hands. Another negative is the lack of a standard headphones jack. To use headphones, an adapter had to be purchased. Nintendo released a second version of the SP, known internally as the Mark II. It replaced the front-lit screen with a high-quality backlit screen. Other than that, it's identical. Even after 2 revisions, the Game Boy Advance is still fully backwards compatible with previous Game Boy lines. There are a few incompatibilities due to the cartridge slot location, but other than that, you can still play Game Boy and Game Boy Color games. Also released in 2003 is this hunk of plastic, the Game Boy Player. Like the Super Game Boy, it allowed Game Boy fans to play their games on a TV by attaching the Game Boy Player to the bottom of a GameCube. Game Boy Advance games really stand out on the Game Boy Player and almost outshine Super Nintendo games. It is nearly fully compatible with every game for every Game Boy model. Users can choose both windowed and full screen and a number of other enhancements. In 2005, Nintendo released the Game Boy Micro, the smallest Game Boy model yet. It features a smaller screen, but has the same resolution. The coolest feature has got to be the removable faceplates. I use one for travel, so I don't scratch up my classic faceplate that resembles a Japanese Famicom controller. The screen is bright and backlit and surprisingly easy to see considering its size. The orientation has been reverted back to a controller-like shape. In fact, the whole system is about the size of a standard NES controller. Overall, it's a very playable system, and small enough to fit in your pocket with your cell phone and change or whatever. Unfortunately, the Micro is unable to play any legacy games. It is limited to only Game Boy Advance games. In the long-running Game Boy line, the Micro is the first not to include backwards compatibility. If you're a fan of older games, the Micro cannot be the only Game Boy system you own. Another major downside is that the faceplate is the lens. If it gets scratched, it can lower visibility. The flip design of the SP protects the lens, but the Micro has no such protection. And that brings us to the last handheld to carry the Game Boy brand. There was some talk that Nintendo had officially retired the name, but they now say it's not gone forever. The release of the Nintendo DS has ended an era. Although it can play Game Boy Advance games, so the Game Boy brand still lives on today, at least partially. Even though the Micro is the newest Game Boy, if you're only going to own one model, I recommend the SP. It's still small and fully backwards compatible. With how many Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Advance games, you really can't go wrong. Now if you're wondering why I didn't talk about this, well, my answer to you is the Virtual Boy is not a Game Boy. It was originally designed by the late Gunpei Yokoi, inventor of the Game Boy, but I don't think it really counts as part of the Game Boy line. It has an interesting story, so I may do a Virtual Boy show sometime in the future. Now it's time for Kane's 2 Bits! 1. If you buy a Game Boy Advance Micro, I highly recommend you choosing a faceplate as your pocket whipping boy. Just pick one that you like the least and let it get scratched. My whipping boy, it's scratched to hell, but it works just fine and I can see through it. It mostly just looks bad. 2. From the original all the way to the Micro, Nintendo has sold almost 200 million units worldwide bearing the Game Boy logo. That's even more than the PS2. I don't think there is a single console or handheld as widely recognizable as the Game Boy. It truly is a gaming icon. That's my 2 bits. If you have any thoughts or stories about your experiences with any Game Boy model, please leave a comment or video response. As always, I'm your humble 2-bit gamer. Thanks for watching.